participants to this webinar on holistic approaches to environmental remediation. My name is Catrinel Turcanu. I coordinate the program for integration of social and ethical aspects into nuclear research at the Belgian Nuclear Research Center, and I will be your moderator today. The webinar is organized in collaboration with the SHARE platform for social sciences and humanities in ionizing radiation research, the ENVIRONET network for environmental remediation of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the European Norm Association. The webinar explores why and how can social and economic aspects be considered alongside more technical aspects in decision-making in the scope of environmental remediation projects. At the end of the presentations, we will be able to take questions addressed to the panelists. I kindly ask you to use for this the chat option to all panelists and attendees so that your comments and questions are visible as well to panelists and to the other participants. I'd like to give the word now to Christophe Xerri, Director of the Nuclear Fuel Cycle and Waste Technology Division of the International Atomic Energy Agency, to open the webinar. Mr. Xerri, you have the word.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for SHARE and RICOMET to have come together to organize this webinar with the support of SCK CEN and the European Norm Association. We're very happy to, and especially with the ENVIRONET initiative, to be part of that. As you know, usually the agency is full of scientists, and we tend to look at things on a very technical approach. And the first holistic things, and sometimes the often holistic things that we think about is, don't forget about safety. Safety is important. Technology and safety are going together. So that's the first step of holistic. But I think that there is a lot of other aspects to be taken into account. Obviously, it's true for environmental remediation, but not only. When you follow the discussion on siting waste disposal, you can see also that it's a mix of safety, of technology, of economics, of social dimension, of political dimension. So what we will discuss today is not only important for environmental remediation, but in fact for a broader audience will benefit certainly from this discussion. From the agency point of view, it's not for us to tell to anyone how they should be organized and what they should do in details, but it's certainly our role to bring the attention of everyone, and especially of our usual stakeholders who are usual technical and scientific people, that any decision as soon as it takes into account human and community cannot be based only on science and should integrate other dimension, economic and social dimension being here extremely important. And the second thing which is important is to recognize that even if an engineer has plenty of ideas on all those topics, there are people who are expert in economics, expert in political science, expert in social science, and that those experts are as expert in their domain as the engineer is in his own domain. And it's important when we're talking about holistic things that all the components could work together. So I'm very happy to say that in the programs that you have put together for this webinar, we have a lot of different complementary perspectives, and the social scientists not only have not been forgotten, but have also a very important role in this aspect. On a personal point of view, I was directly in line of some of this aspect when I was based in Japan from 2007 to 2015. So you will I've understood that from 2011 to 2015, some of the aspects were related to the environmental remediation aspect of Fukushima. And then I thought there will be a very useful presentation on that. I could also, on a personal basis, visiting these areas on a regular frequency and talking with many people, really understand how much and how important it is to take the social and economical dimension on top of the technical aspects. So I'm really looking forward for a very exciting topic here. Obviously, there are accidents, but not only, and I'm very appreciative that European Norm Association is associated also with this event. We will have a conference dedicated to norm in 1 month's time, and that's also a very timely opportunity to remind that that is also something to be taken into account. So I wish a very successful meeting. Thank you to all of us for your cooperation and for your participation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Xerri. I have now the pleasure to introduce the Maestri project, which will deal precisely with the holistic approaches to decision making. Yes, so this project is a joint work of the ENVIRONET Network for Environmental Remediation with participation from several member states. The scientific secretary on behalf of the International Atomic Energy Agency is Horst Monken-Fernandes, and I am the project chair. So indeed, the project aims to develop a structured framework for decision making that considers in an integrated manner the different dimensions, and we have heard about social, economic, environmental, and also the different activities, for instance, environmental remediation as well as waste management, that are relevant to the management of sites contaminated by ongoing or past activities, including nuclear accidents or incidents. And with a view to bring these sites to sustainable end states suitable for beneficial use. The project aims in particular to develop case studies and practical guidance, really hands-on, demonstrating the use of this developed framework. The roots of the project lie in the ENVIRONET technical meeting in 2017, when the need was recognized for integrated frameworks for decision-making, this meaning including social and economic aspects and also stakeholder engagement and sustainability considerations. The ENVIRONET technical meetings in 2018 and 2019 have helped to discuss the project and set the basis for the terms of reference. And the project actually started in the beginning of this year with a 2-year plan. Currently, the project has 3 task groups. The first task group aims at developing a framework for social multi-criteria evaluation. And the focus here is on the integration of technical and non-technical factors, on participatory aspects, as well as development of improved decision support tools that would be made available for the community of practice so that they can test their environmental remediation strategies and policies. The second task group deals with evaluation of environmental management dimensions, looking more into detail at some factors that have been set out in task group 1. And here, the main point will be to develop case studies of methodological approaches for the evaluation of social and economic impacts. And finally, the third task group deals with engaging a community of practice, and that will deal with validation of the frameworks and models developed by the other 2 task groups, illustration of best practice, as well as development of training material. Our first activity is the development of a baseline report, which is a cross-cutting activity looking at state-of-the-art and challenges in decision-making for environmental remediation. And this is currently an ongoing activity. In the terms of reference, Maestri aims at being an action-oriented project, multidisciplinary, so cooperation with social scientists is not only acknowledged as beneficial, but also as needed. Therefore, the collaboration with the SHARE platform today. And also the expected outcome is to provide a solid basis for improving decision-making processes in the scope of environmental remediation, at the same time building on and linking with existing activities at the level of the agency as well as the European Commission, and experience, particular experience from different member states. The target audience are regulatory bodies, implementers, but I would say all stakeholders that have an interest in environmental remediation projects. If you are interested, you are very welcome to participate as a member. You can register via the Environet network of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So you can participate in different ways, either receiving information or sharing your experiences, or even being an active participant to the reports and to the analysis that we are doing. With this, thank you very much for allowing me to present the Maestri project. And now I'd like to start the presentation of the panelists. And we will now listen first to Dr. Hiroyuki Kuroda, who will speak about environmental remediation in areas affected by the Fukushima accident. Dr. Kuroda is a policy researcher at the Office for the Contamination of Radioactive Materials and International Cooperation within the Ministry of Environment in Japan. The presentation has been prepared jointly with Dr. Tadashi Inoue. Dr. Inoue is involved in the environmental remediation of the affected areas and the commissioning after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident, serving as division head of the Fukushima Prefectural Center for Environmental Creation. So Dr. Kuroda, you have the word. You have to unmute your microphone and share your screen.
Thank you very much, Catrinel. Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hiro Kuroda from Ministry of the Environment, Japan. Today, I'd like to show you the policy taken for off-site environmental remediation in Fukushima after TEPCO Fukushima nuclear power plant accident. First of all, I would like to explain about the results and effects of the whole area decontamination. In August 2011, the Act of Special Measures was enacted to address the environmental contamination caused by the radioactive substances released as a result of the accident. Based on the action on special measures, the decontamination process is divided in two main areas. The first is the Special Decontamination Area, SDA, where the air dose rate is high and the government conducts the decontamination project directly. The second is the Intensive Contamination Survey Area, ICSA, where the air dose rate is relatively low and each municipality conducts its own decontamination project. At the end of March 2017, in SDA, MOE completed the decontamination work. Due to this achievement, the evacuation orders have been lifted in 9 municipalities. Next, the municipalities designated by ICSA also completed all decontamination works on March 19, 2018. This means that the decontamination works were completed except for difficult to return zone, DRZ. We will continue to monitor the effects of the decontamination and, if necessary, implement a supplementary decontamination and risk communication measures. I'll show you the process of how actual decontamination work is carried out. First, the land and the building were surveyed, then radiation was measured, and a decontamination plan was developed to implement effective decontamination methods. We obtain prior consent from the residents and the owners of the building for survey and the decontamination process, and reported the results of the decontamination process. After decontamination, we conduct post-monitoring to see the effects of the decontamination. MOE thinks this continuous and persistent communication with residents is one of the reasons why we successfully completed the decontamination project as planned. Next, let me explain more specifically about the effectiveness of the decontamination in SDA. Air dose rates have been decreased by 60% in residential area and 58% in farmland. And through the post-decontamination monitoring, it is confirmed that the effectiveness of whole area decontamination has been maintained. As shown in the picture on the left, the removed soil and other materials generated by the contamination work were temporarily stored at the temporary storage site, TSS, and then transported to the interim storage facility, ISF, which I will discuss later. The temporary storage site is borrowed from the residents and must be returned to them. Based on the estimated volume of soil to be transported to temporary storage facility and on a trial calculation based on the past results, we aim to remove soil from up to 60% of the 1,300 temporary storage sites by the beginning of fiscal 2020, and to complete the restoration of up to 40% of the temporary storage site to their original state. In difficult return zone, as a result of the significant decrease in air dose rate and the strong request from local residents to return to their home, the national government amended the law to set specified reconstruction and revitalization base, SRRB, for municipalities existing in the zone. In SRRB, Ministry of the Environment promotes to carry out environmental improvements such as house demolition, decontamination, and waste management with the aim of lifting the evacuation orders. I'd like to speak about the construction progress of the ISF and recycling demonstration project. In Fukushima Prefecture, a large volume of contaminated soil and waste has been generated from off-site decontamination works, and it is currently difficult to classify methods of final disposal. That is why it is essential to establish an interim storage facility, ISF, to safely manage and store the soil and waste intensively until the final disposal. This is a prospect for 5-year ad hoc policy on ISF. As of June 2020, about 7.81 million cubic meters of removed soil and waste has been transported to ISF. By the end of March 2022, MOE plans to transport almost all the soil and waste to ISF, obtaining local understanding and safety first basis. Next, I'd like to introduce the initiative related to efforts of final disposal after interim storage. According to the law, the government shall take necessary measures for the final disposal outside of Fukushima Prefecture within 30 years after the start of the interim storage. As shown on this slide, in 2014, the government indicated its policy of proceeding with the 8 steps toward the final disposal of waste outside the prefecture. The following is a schedule of our technology development strategy for volume reduction and recycling of removed soil. We are trying to reduce amount of removed soil for final disposal by increasing the amount of soil to be recycled as much as possible. We aim to complete the development of basic technology in about 10 years by setting clear goals and priorities for development of volume reduction and recycling technology. I'll show you the example of a demonstration project by MOE in Iitate village in Fukushima. In response to the request from Iitate village, the removed soil stored at the temporary storage site in Iitate village will be recycled and experimented in cultivation of flowers and energy crops in the village. Lastly, I would like to speak about our communication activities and the future-oriented project. MOE has been making efforts to share correct information not only with local residents, but also with international communities. MOE implemented various communication measures such as English website, brochures, and displays in international meetings. You can check them on MOE English website. Internationally, in 2011 and 2013, we received a mission from IAEA and received various evaluations and advice. We'd like to share our knowledge and experiences with international community. I'd like to ask for your continuous cooperation. In response to the local needs in Fukushima, MOE will also promote future-oriented initiatives to create and rediscover the strengths of the region from environmental perspective of decarbonization, resource recycling, and the coexistence with nature, in addition to environmental restoration. We will also engage in risk communication, public relations, and information dissemination to address radiation health concerns and strategically develop a cross-sectional policy package through these efforts. That's all my presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kuroda, for this very good update of the decontamination and reconstruction works in Japan. We will now listen to our second panelist, David Collier, concerning inclusion of economic factors in remediation and state option assessments. David is a respected stakeholder strategist who has managed or evaluated major programs in the United Kingdom, other European countries, as well as Russia and the Ukraine. He has been closely involved in structured option assessment and strategy development methodologies in the United Kingdom, and specializes in controversial projects, particularly where local partnerships are being established or stakeholders are involved in strategic decision-making. Dr. Kuroda, if you can unshare your screen, and then David, you can unmute your microphone and share your
screen here.
It's okay, it's already shared.
Right, okay. Well, I'm an independent specialist in option assessments, as Catrinel explained. And so I'm speaking in a personal capacity. I don't represent any organization. So I can perhaps speak a little more freely about some of the challenges that I'm hoping Maestri can help us with. I'm going to focus a little bit on the economics, but it's not all about the economics. I'm just going to give you a little bit of context on what we are dealing with in the UK. Then some of the challenges that I see, some of the tools that I'm trying to use and my colleagues are trying to use, a few experiences, and then some final reflections. So here we are. Many of you will know that we have a large number of nuclear sites to clear up. The green ones are to do with power operation. The big ones are Sellafield, which has been used for a wide range of purposes, including military, and that is where most of our contaminated land is. We also have some at the north of Scotland in Inoue, and we have money to find for a deep repository program, and we're looking for a site for that at the moment. We have a lot of sites, but the main problem is at Sellafield. This is how our estimates of the costs have varied. These are from the government's website mentioned at the bottom. So if you see in 2005, we thought we had something like 35 billion pounds to find. That is a very large sum of money. But we realized that we really didn't understand the costs. They've increased, the cost of disposal, understanding what we have. And now we have, well, depending on your assumptions, 100 to 200 billion. That is a very large sum of money. It's, I think, about a tenth. If you, it's spread over a very long time period, but if you spent it in 1 year, that will be 1/10 of the UK's GDP. We're about 2% of the world, so that is 0.2% of the world's gross national product if you spent it all on 1 year to clean this up. It's a big project to do so, and that means there are big incentives to find ways of simplifying matters. I really have to say this is not about Sellafield. These are my observations from the UK and elsewhere, and also I'm not a radioactive waste specialist. I deal mainly with the community engagement side. But having said that, this is what I see as some of the challenges. Huge cost of cleanup, but huge potential savings. We have now got some new regulatory thinking, which opens up some big possibilities for saving money, particularly in deciding and having choice about what we can leave within the ground and what we have to take away and dispose of somewhere else. We now have more flexibility, but we have a lot of thinking to do. We have new options to think about, new costings to run. We want to engage with the community, because if we're going to leave, we do anyway, but if we're going to leave material in place where we had promised previously to clear a site, then we obviously have to take the community with us. We need their support, and we want to engage. We want to be rational, so that the savings that we're talking about and the detriments and the advantages that communities might expect are fairly and rationally dealt with. But then we also have this added complexity about who's fair to who, because the local stakeholders, obviously it's their community, the site is in their state. But if we're going to be moving radioactive waste around, if we're going to take it off site, put it somewhere else maybe, there's transport, then we have regional stakeholders to think about as well. And then of course, this is a large sum of money. This is a national problem. The country as a whole is paying for it. So, and the country as a whole could spend that money somewhere else if it wasn't cleaning up these sites. So it's not a simple problem. A further consideration that we're hoping Maestri can help us with is these differences between the end state, which is effectively the how you leave the land, whether contamination, whether it's radiological or conventional contamination, how you leave the land, and end use, which is, and what would we use the site for afterwards? It's easy for communities to think about what they would like to use the site for, maybe less easy for them to get involved in the detail of exactly what isotopes are left where. We talked this morning about difficulties of risk communication and establishing common frameworks for understanding levels of risk, and that comes into it. So we want to save savings and input. We want to find ways to value the environmental condition of the land at the end. If we're going to change that condition from what we said to some new state, or if we're going to achieve some increment in cleanup, well, what is that worth? Because we have to balance it against expenditure. Other things as well, of course, as we're talking about, but we do have to find some way of valuing cleanup increment versus cost, and that's difficult, especially where that last point, the cost is actually very uncertain. That graph I showed you earlier shows that we're coming to a much clearer picture of what the overall cost of dealing with our wastes is going to be. But when you start looking at individual areas of individual sites, or where you're going to move the waste to and how much it will cost to deal with it, then at a micro level, it's actually very uncertain. We don't always know what we have in which area of land. So we have some challenges, but we have some big opportunities, and we're really starting to make serious progress. So we'll get there. Here, just to remind you what Sellafield as an example looks like. Incredibly complex. each area on that site might have different conditions, might need a different sort of solution. And so when we're talking about option assessments in the UK, we're often talking about a patchwork of land where individual, even down to a few square meters, might be different to a few square meters further on in terms of conventional contamination like asbestos or radiological conditions. Some is contaminated quite heavily, some has almost no contamination at all. You'll also see that our areas are sometimes quite remote. So when you're thinking of end use, I'm not talking about Sellafield particularly, but if you're thinking of end use, you have to think, well, if we turn that back to a completely greenfield site on which we could grow crops, well, there are other green fields locally. Would we really want to reuse that site for agriculture or for industry, or would we just do it somewhere else? And that decision affects how much effort we would put into cleaning up a site. And obviously that's of great interest to the community, great concern, and they have to be engaged in those decisions, not just consulted, but engaged in those decisions. And we have to find ways not just to consult them, but engage with them in ways that we can actually make sense of it. So some tools. What do we use? We have, I'll go through these quite quickly. We have a quantitative toolkits. We have a multi-criteria analysis. We also have some methodologies for ranking and rating things. We have a common assessment framework, which is a great help, which the Nuclear Decommissioning Agency has given us. Basically all RADWISE assessments in the UK at site or wider level use the same framework covering technical, social, environmental and cost. So we have that's a big advantage. We have a lot of familiarity within our key stakeholders in how to apply that and in how to apply multi-criteria analysis, especially at the qualitative level. And that's a great advantage. We also have ways of thinking top down. Say, take a site and say there's the east, the west, okay, so let's optimize that, and then let's try and look at individual areas and see how they differ. But we also use bottom up, where we look at smaller areas and then aggregate it. So we have tools that build up and build down, if you see what I mean. And we also are starting to understand more about how we can use scenarios to understand off-site impacts, because obviously if we clean up and remove contamination from somewhere, it has to go somewhere else. And how do we then balance that? We have different communities involved, perhaps. So how do we bring these two things together? And we're now using more about scenarios. So it's less about individual options for individual parts of a site. It's more about building scenarios and using EIA and strategic environmental assessments for wider. I think we also see a noticeable trend in not just using multi-criteria analysis or something, but trying to express a clear decision logic so that we can help people understand and comment and engage with a decision logic, not just moving levels up or down. We'll come back to that. I've picked out a few key experiences here, just to prompt some discussion later on maybe. Communities, in my experience, usually want to understand and input to decision making, but in most cases, except in the big decisions, they don't want to make the decisions, and they feel very unhappy if we are, as engineers and specialists, asking them to make technical decisions. They think that's wrong and it should be our responsibility. That's often the case, not always, but often the case. We also have difficulties to overcome, in that we can't engage the whole community. So how do we engage with representatives of that community? And are we building relationships where it's always the same people on one side talking to the same people on the other, building a common understanding which is actually separate from the community. So it's something to think about. We always use MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis. None of us actually think that way in daily life. But these structured methods give us repeatability, and they also give people confidence that we understand we are doing something in a structured, logical way, even if they don't want to get involved in the detail. Approaching decision-making limited to one site. Yes, we have an issue because just in contract terms, projects are set up and contracts are let for projects on particular sites, maybe for about a part of a particular site. So the way the contract strategy for running decision processes and running decision analysis processes, if it doesn't span enough of the site or can deal with cross-site trade-offs, then you will tend just to focus on limited trade-offs and you will not engage on these big trade-offs. It's a contract strategy problem. Three quick additional ones. People are realistic. I would say that they are practical. Communities, we think sometimes we fear talking to them and that they will be unrealistic, but they tend to be sensible people and take sensible views on things. It's very rare that you get somebody trying to do something strange. But at a macro level, I said about economics, how much you care about environment and some of the small things in part depends on whether you think your children will have a job. You know, what will the social impact be on the area of what you're proposing? Does it result in more jobs or less jobs, or will it increase the amount of skilled employment locally, or will it decrease it? And you know, people when they talk about economics, they really think about jobs for their communities, because some of our sites are in remote areas and it's difficult. I'd say two final things. Value of life type calculations. A life is worth $1 million, so you should spend $1 million to save a life. Everybody on every engagement I've ever worked in just refuses to engage with that concept. The thought that you can put a value of money on a life goes down very badly with communities usually, even though as planners we use this sort of concept all the time. And one final point, engaging on economics, it all depends whose money it is. So if I say that I can save you £5 million on this site, but the community has to take something, well, where will that money be spent? Will it be spent on more government expenditure, or will it be spent on a new hospital? Whose money it is makes a big difference. And oops, I'll just do some final reflections because I think I'm coming up to my 15 minutes, Catherine. I would say MCDA is not always a help. Communities find it difficult to value diverse trade-offs. We find it difficult to handle these diverse trade-offs. So I think Maestri, I hope, is going to just give us a broader context. I hope it's going to help us explain decision logic better. Because we know that the decision logic we're telling, it has to be persuasive. There has to be a good story. Are there ways in which we can formalize and represent this? That would be a great help. We know economics is more than cost. Sometimes we just limit it to cost. We need to do better there. The value of money depends on whether it's yours or not. I said something about that earlier. How do we deal with this thing? How do we deal with the fact that a community will talk about cost in a different way depending on how it would be spent if it wasn't spent on their site. And finally, I would say we talk, a lot of our work is framed around option assessments. Should we do option A or B or C? And then we in some way compare those two things. And it leads to some very artificial situations where we try and bring everything to options that can be compared. We've looked at scenarios, we're trying to move into scenarios, but this tendency to try and make everything into options, which we then compare, is not always helpful. And so I'm wondering whether there are any actually options to option assessment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. You clearly showed us that the social and economic aspects are definitely related, which is also a point we wish to emphasize in the Maestri project. We will now listen to the next presentation from Bieke Abelshausen, which will be on sustainable environmental management. Dr. Abelshausen is a human ecologist at the Belgian Nuclear Research Center. Her expertise covers, among others, sustainability, development cooperation, community resilience, and interdisciplinarity. Bieke, you have the word. Don't forget to unmute your microphone and share your screen.
Hello. Thank you for the kind introduction. Let's start the presentation. Okay. So as Catrinel stated in the beginning, in the frame of the Maestri project, we are looking into how environmental remediation, what the state of the art of it is and how it actually works in practice. So for this presentation, we will be focusing on the social aspects of it and why they are considered as important. Additionally, we will be looking at opportunities environmental management and sustainability yield for finding a balance between social, environmental, and economic aspects. And specifically, we want to stress the importance of community for the longer term aspects of sustainable environmental remediation. But let's start with what environmental management then actually is and what its relationship is to environmental remediation. So environmental management is a decision-making system that allows for the integration of social and ecological systems. So with this, the opportunity arises to include the complexity of ecological systems and the complexity of interdependent human, organizational, and institutional systems. So what environmental management aims to do is to move from a reductionistic command and control management approach to a more integrated, adaptive, system-based approach. So environmental management knows three dominant paradigms on decision-making, being science-based, consensus-based, and decision support tools. All of these three paradigms have their benefits and their challenges. Science-based decision-making has as a main benefit that decisions are obviously scientifically grounded on the best available knowledge. These decisions are often, however, perceived to ignore social considerations such as and ethical considerations, and also do not include dialogue. Consensus-based decisions, however, do include this dialogue and often receives a more wide support than scientifically based decisions. They are, however, based on not necessarily on the best available knowledge and are highly dependent on, or highly influenced by emotions. Decision support tools, such as multi-criteria analysis, that was explicated in the previous presentation, have the benefit that they are transparent to a certain degree and therefore also often receive a wide support. These decisions, however, are a bit criticized for, well, not being very creative. They have the benefit that they will always lead to a decision. It is sometimes questions whether this is a sound decision. So decisions in using these tools might also not always necessarily lead to the target goals that were set beforehand, and might have a less broad support under non-expert populations. So for this reason, environmental management actually aspires to combine all of these decision paradigms, but I will go into more detail throughout the presentation. So in the latest years, we have seen that environmental remediation has become more and more addressed as an environmental management approach. So the relationship between both is, however, not always clear, but in essence, environmental remediation is seen as a part of a wider environmental management approach or program. And it will therefore be addressed alongside other aspects such as long-term waste management, and therefore has the opportunity to make long-term decisions. It allows also to encapsulate environmental remediation in a holistic decision-making that allows to integrate social, economic, and environmental aspects. Now, aligned with this evolution for environmental management, there is also a trend towards sustainability. Now, this is aligned with the general trend in society to promote sustainable development. And we see that nowadays common practice is to include at least some sustainability considerations in remediation. Broad consideration of sustainabilities are thus far, however, not mainstream. So the justification for sustainable remediation is often placed on insufficient inclusion of social aspects in environmental remediation, with the most common social criteria included being health and safety. Other criteria are often excluded or not included to the same degree, such as cultural heritage, equity, local participation, and acceptance. So, sustainable environmental remediation aspires to include these other criteria based on the context of the specific site. So there are various rationales for the inclusion of social aspects. Now, the rationale for the inclusion will possibly also influence what the outcome of the remediation process will be. So for instrumental reasons, social aspects are included to serve a specific purpose. For example, to gain wide support for the remedial action chosen. Now, for substantive reasons, social aspects are included to lead to better knowledge, to gain more insight in understanding of the site context and the communities that actually live there. Now, as a third rationale, social aspects are also included because it is considered the right thing to do, as social and ecological systems are interrelated. So furthermore, we see that social aspects exist within the three dominant paradigms on decision-making in interrelated manners. So for science-based decision-making, we see that it is the same as for exact sciences. It is nothing more than including the social sciences in the science-based decision-making. Why is this important? For example, we see that if research has shown that people who live in areas might actually want a zero contamination, and they might consider this as an important criteria. So this science would then be also taken into the decision-making process. Now, concerning consensus-based decision-making, social aspects are most easily included via stakeholder participation, being the stakeholders of the quintuple helix, as is shown on the figure on the slide. Now, concerning decision support tools, including societal aspect entails both quantitative as well as qualitative aspects. So decisions of measuring qualitative criteria and placing weights can be based on consensus via, for example, stakeholder participation. So as you can see, a combination of all of these is what is aspired for. Now, when we look at examples from the field, we can see that there is a difference between the situation in which you are conducting your environmental remediation. in legacy sites, and we use the example of a legacy site in Belgium, we see that social aspects, for example, change over time. So different aspects are considered as important dependent on whether we discuss the time of contamination or the time of the remediation. So in legacy cases, our Belgian case, for example, showed that dependency on the polluting company for income influences social aspects that were considered important by local communities, and they therefore change if this economic dependency would change. Now, a clear example of this is the who pays question that is often asked and is considered as a very important one. For local communities, if there is a risk of bankruptcy of the company, for example, this will be a very determining factor as to what they would consider important when answering this question. Now, when we look at the context, we see that the zeitgeist in which a decision was made influenced the importance placed on a certain aspect. So at the time of remediation, when we asked these questions, we saw that in general society, there was an increased awareness of effects of pollution on health or the effects of green spaces on health. So we saw that the end use that people or local communities envisioned were affected by these general trends in society. So there would be a more increased demand for green spaces than it might be in other time frames. So furthermore, when looking at legacy sites in Belgium, concerning stakeholder participation, we see that remediation processes often enjoyed more time to set up participatory processing, making it easier to include social aspects. Because the contamination is historic, we also saw that participatory processes might already exist as they were set up at the time of the contamination, such as citizens group who joined together or town meetings who had occurred at various spaces in time. And that might still be, so might be easier to set them up again at the time of remediation. So in general, we can see that for legacy sites, environmental management allows for a thorough reflection of rationales for participation and the inclusion of social aspects because they have the benefit of time, at least when you would compare it to, for example, an accident situation. Now, when we look at an accident situation, we used the example of a hypothetical accident in Belgium that we researched and looked at what the stakeholder participation in these processes would be. Now, a lot of these examples are also true for what we have seen in Japan. So we see here that in case of an accident, the inclusion of social aspects is more challenging, or at least it is perceived as such. Now, the main influencing factor is time, which in case of an accident is directly related to the various phases of an emergency. So when we look at these different phases, we see, for example, that health and safety are in the initial stages the main aspects and that they receive the highest weight. Now, in the recovery phase, however, other aspects such as returning to one's community could become more important. Now I will go into more depth what this community means later and how this then relates to this recovery phase. When it comes to stakeholder participation, of course, it is highly dependent on the phase in which this would occur. There is insufficient time in an emergency to start setting up a stakeholder process. So for this reason, it is important, and this is well known, that it would exist in a preparedness phase. This is, however, extremely challenging, mainly because keeping stakeholders motivated for a possible accident in a near or very distant future is very challenging. However, in a recovery phase, there is then again the opportunity of time, and decisions being made that have been made already could possibly be adapted to new knowledge that was gained from these participatory processes. So as we saw in our hypothetical case, and as is the case in Japan, community plays an important role in remediation decisions. And for this reason, a community-based approach for environmental remediation could be considered as a possible answer to a lack of inclusion of social consideration. So first of all, when considering a community-based approach, it's important to understand what a community is. So there is a dynamic interpretation of community. There is a geographical community, but there are also communities based on communalities. Examples are communities of practice or communities of interest, but also online communities, such as the Twitter community, let's say. And communities can be both homogeneous and heterogeneous. So it is very important to contextualize the community in which you are working and which of these communities exist on the site you are remediating. So in case of an accident, the importance, for example, placed on a community's desire to return to its community can therefore take many forms, and it does not necessarily mean a returning to a geographical location, but it can also mean returning to a sense of community that existed before an accident. So therefore, this contextualization is very important. So now this community-based sustainable environmental remediation is an assets-based approach. It's quite a novel approach in sustainability sciences, and it starts from within a community. So the ownership of the site remediation actually lies with this community. And the idea is to build on what is already present versus starting from what is missing. So it is building on the assets or strength of a community rather than the needs of this community. The idea behind this is that it will yield more long-term sustainable results. So now in order to do this, a community capitals framework was developed, which is a framework for the identification of assets in a community. I will not go into too much details, but this provides you an overview of what this framework is. So there are 7 capitals. And the idea behind it is that this framework allows for the identification of these assets and determine which aspects should or can be included in remediation processes, as well as what the importance is that will be placed on them by the various stakeholders within this community. So by starting from within a community, remedial actions are perceived to be more sustainable, or at least hoped to be more sustainable, achieving long-term results, have less adverse effects, and receive wide support. So the benefits of this framework are that it allows for contextualization needed for decision-making, that it allows for an identification of complex relationships, and it provides a framework for trade-offs. As it was also said in the previous presentation, making trade-offs is something that people scare away from sometimes, especially community struggles with making these very difficult trade-offs. So this could be an added value to actually make these trade-offs. And it can also be used as a support for weighing criteria in, for example, multi-criteria decision analysis through the various decision-making systems that exist. So in conclusion, we can therefore say that sustainable environmental management ideally would be a combination of these decision-making systems and this asset-based community development framework. So it would include the science-based decision-making, the consensus-based decision-making, including participatory processes, and it can make use of decision support tools. There have also been developed sustainable decision support tools such as sustainable MCDAs. An example is included in the slide. And it would then additionally include this assets-based community development to have this, to really embed what you are doing in your community and to have long-term sustainable solutions of which the communities are the actual owner. So that in short was what is envisioned with sustainable environmental management and why social aspects are considered to be important in environmental remediation. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Bieke. I think that probably the next presentation will address some of the points mentioned by you and also by David related to decision support tools. So our last presentation is from Professor Giuseppe Munda from the European Commission Joint Research Center in Ispra. He will introduce social multi-criteria evaluation and as a practical way to balance the different remediation options from the point of view of various criteria. So Professor Munda is a scientific officer at the Modeling, Indicators and Impact Evaluation Unit of the Joint Research Center, and formerly professor at the Department of Economics and Economic History at the University of Barcelona. So Professor Munda, you have the word. Don't forget to unmute and share the screen.
Thank you, Catrinel. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the concept of social multi-criteria evaluation in the context of environmental management. It is important we have clear that when we talk about multi-criteria decision analysis, we are talking in a kind of world of many languages. And above all, the multi-criteria decision analysis is a framework that can be used in many different fields. So what I will try to focus is about the main characteristics that a methodological framework should have to be applied to environmental management issues. First of all, is multi-criteria decision analysis as a whole a framework useful for environmental management? Well, I would say immediately yes. Let's talk the general framework of sustainable development. In theory, as in this slide was clearly stated, should imply to maximize simultaneously biological system goals, economic system goals, social system goals. So it's clear that there is an integration of various dimensions, typical environmental, economic, and social, but also in a, let's say, utopic world, we should try to maximize all these dimensions. Unfortunately, everyday life teaches us that to maximize, to have everything simultaneously always is often at least impossible. It's desirable, but it's very difficult to achieve. Our experience teaches us that it's more common to find a kind of reasonable solution. What is called, technically speaking, in multi-criteria analysis, compromise solution. So from one side, we have the ideal point, simultaneously the maximum on all dimensions, the best of the possible worlds. If this best of possible worlds is not possible to achieve, we try to find a compromise solution. So basically, when we talk from a technical point of view, multi-criteria analysis, at least in its discrete version, we are talking about different options that can be evaluated according to completely different dimensions. So economic, environmental, social, for examples, expressed by different criteria that can be on completely different measurement units, for example, money, biodiversity loss, employment, etc., but also in different measurement scales, quantitative and qualitative. So it's very flexible framework. Which is the most important problem to use multi-criteria analysis. There is a kind of labyrinth. We have many, many approaches. This is not just because scientists like to puzzle themselves and invent continuously new methods that can be part of the explanations, but I think the real explanation is that multi-criteria decision analysis as a general framework can be used in many different fields. So it's not the same to apply multi-criteria decision analysis in financial economics, in electrical engineer, or in environmental management. It's completely different. So first of all, the class of problems, not the single problem, the class of problems can be very different. Then the philosophical approach has to be different. Third, the method, what we normally call the method, that is just a technical tool that helps us in frame all the different characteristics of our problem, has to be different. For example, I just suggest for people who want to navigate a bit this world, there is this recent book, there's the multi-criteria decision analysis state of the art, where you can see different approaches to completely different problems. What is social multi-criteria evaluation? Is a framework, first of all, methodological, philosophical framework, explicitly developed for policy issues, above all for sustainability issues, where, said in technical word, we try to combine technical and social incommensurability. This long word incommensurability simply means that when we want to frame a problem, we will have different technical dimension. That's very typical in all nuclear issues. You have to be very technical. You have to know which are the contamination levels, etc., etc. But as all the speakers before me already said, it's very important also which are the social perceptions of the problem, social values, the interests and the values that in society look at that problem and try to see. We have to try to see the problem we are dealing with using the eyes of the different social actors. It's very important, just to conclude this part, that when we use different, when I say we can use different methods, also means that all the framework we use is completely different. If we are in financial economics, to have a compensatory framework is desirable, okay? Because if we lose some money in an investment, but we get more money in another investment, this is okay. So it makes sense to talk about trade-offs. If we are in environmental management in sustainability issues, to have compensability, complete at least compensability between environmental dimension and economic dimension is completely wrong, because if we allow for this full compensability, basically the environmental dimension, the social dimension is not taken into account, okay? So we have to consider that in that case, we have not to talk about trade-off, but about importance of dimensions and criteria we use. And this is completely different from the philosophical point of view, from the way you structure the problem, and from the way you use the tools, okay? The way you, for example, define weights. So we have to take a lot of care when we use multi-criteria decision analysis to be consistent with our premises, because otherwise a lot of confusion arises and some big mistakes may occur. So integration, when we talk about integration, we are saying that we try to integrate different languages by respecting the origins of these sciences. For example, there is a famous example in economics. Is more valuable a diamond or 1 liter of water? There is no clear general answer, because if you are in Paris, of course, the diamond is more valuable, but if you are in the middle of a desert, maybe water is more valuable, okay? So in economics, you don't have any general answer to the question, what is more valuable? one of the most important ecologists of the 20th century, Odum, wrote a book about energy where he said, okay, from the ecological perspective, what makes sense is that an ecosystem is more valuable if it embodies, if it has the capacity, the potential of generate a lot of energy. From the ecosystem point of view, this makes a lot of sense. But then Odum said, okay, but in this way we can also value the economic, okay? We can also express the economic value in terms of energy. That of course is wrong because the energy of an ecosystem is always the same, cannot change like on the contrary an economic value should do. So in principle, we cannot use economics to express the ecosystem value, but on the other side, we cannot use ecology to express the economic value. We need to integrate the sciences with their own languages. This is exactly the idea of multi-criteria decision analysis, that even in economics is beginning now to be realized. For example, the Nobel Prize, Amartya Sen was very clear in this, saying that one of the most important mistakes in economic science for many decades has been the idea that everything should be expressed into money terms. And then we can use just one measurement rod to compare all different dimensions. This cannot be done in economics, cannot be done in ecology, cannot be done in whatever science we consider alone if we want to have a real integrated approach. Okay, one important point then. When we talk about different measurement different measurement units and different policy objects, we have to consider that that means that we have to compare different possibility, different policy options according to two important questions. According to what? According to which dimension? But please remember that behind any dimension, there are interests, there are social actors, there are preferences, there are values, ethical values, for example, okay? So we cannot have a split between what and whom, okay? As what was said before, money of whom? This is not only about money, it's about all the dimension we want to consider in a given policy framework. This is even more important in sustainability, where it has been very clearly recognized since the beginning of studies about sustainability that each social actor has his or her own objectives, and so we have to try to take into account them all. So in practically speaking, what social multi-criteria analysis is doing, it's trying to combine typical sociological tools, basically participatory tool. For example, institutional analysis to have an idea who are the relevant actors in a given problem. Then you may compare focus group, interviews, questionnaires, and so on and so forth, along all the process. In this way, when we generate criteria, options, etc., what we are considering is not what is considered relevant by a policymaker alone or by a scientist alone, but by the whole society or the whole communities who has a stake in that decisions. Okay. Important point, these steps are not rigid. Basically, social multi-criteria evaluation, general multi-criteria decision analysis is very flexible approach that can be used in different contexts, in different communities. For example, here you see in, this is a case study I was involved with some years ago in Bolivia, where an indigenous community is using social multi-criteria analysis to solve an important problem they had at the level of their community. You can see all this process was adapted very easily to their problem. And what I was particularly impressed is how intuitive they consider the approach for them. Okay, it was very easy to use and to consider it as a reasonable way to tackle that problem. As I told you, of course, the general methodological philosophical framework in general needs also a tool. For example, at the European Commission, we are developing a tool called Socrates. It is about the use of social multi-criteria analysis for policy assessment, in general in the context of the Commission for ex-ante impact assessment. And one of the characteristics of this approach is the possibility to use an ethical matrix, meaning not only the technical multi-criteria matrix, but also a distributional matrix where you consider the different consequences of your option on different social actors, and then you can make some relevant, let's say, you can frame your the issues you are dealing in different way. So what is important, then I conclude, for in case of social multi-criteria evaluation, but in general, when we use multi-criteria analysis, you have to remember that it's not a way of computing a decision, it's a way of helping who is in charge of the decision. It's a support tool, it's not substitution. So we cannot really evaluate the quality of the final decision, but the quality of the process we have adopted, where characteristics like participation, transparency, multi-interdisciplinarity are very important. Okay, and then I conclude. Sorry, I was very, very quick. If you are interested to the social multi-criteria evaluation approach, you may have a look at my book. And thank you very much. And I conclude here. If you have any questions, very happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. In the Maestri project, we intend to detail more this framework and also particularize it for environmental remediation. We now can have a Q&A session with questions for all panelists. I will start with the ones that are already there, and feel free to address questions using the chat option, all panelists and all attendees. So the first question is for Dr. Kuroda, and it relates to the recycling of soil. So one participant noticed that the volume of recycled soil using the options that were presented seems very low in comparison with the available amounts of soils to be recycled. So the question is, how much time will you need to recycle all the soils, and in general, what is the planning on that?
Thank you very much for the question. But so far, I know the recycle policy is now in the experimental situation, so it may take more time to do that. But one of the important things is that how we can get the public understanding for the recycling. So we'd like to show the example of the recycling project and show the public how safe the recycling is. It's one of the big problem for us to prove that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for David, but potentially for all the panelists. And the question is, could we think of developing guidance or codes for the financial assessment of remediation as they are, for instance, existing for reactor decommissioning?
Well, some guidance, yes. I think a common approach would be good. I think we have a framework and we have the words, you know, like cost or spend profiles and things like this, but I don't think we have a consistent framework, and that would be very useful. Hopefully we can do that as part of this project.
Okay, thank you, David. There is a question related to the decision tools which are being used. One participant would like to know your opinion, yours or any other panelists, also perhaps Professor Munda. What do you think about using complex programs like, for instance, self-learning algorithms using artificial intelligence to strengthen the decision logic? So what do you think about the use of artificial intelligence to help decision making? What's your view on this?
Is for me, Catherine?
For any, yes, if you like to answer.
As I told, depends very much on the problem you have. There is no general answer for this. There are some, maybe they might exist some problems where this is a very reasonable approach, but it's very difficult to give a general answer to this type of questions.
Okay.
I will add something. You need training from artificial intelligence. You need data sets to train them on. And that we don't have. But who knows, the future.
Okay, many thanks, David. One question is also for Professor Munda. Could you mention more about the access to the Socrates software developed now at the Commission?
For the moment is under development and is basically for use inside the Commission. But we think that in let's say not far future will be available for public use too. But anyway, as we hope it can be used inside the Maestri project. But yes, let's say not in the very long run, it will be accessible on it's basically a website approach, web app. And should be public available, but you have to wait still some months. I would say reasonably 1 year before it's really public.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Kuroda-san again. Looking back at all the experience from Fukushima, what are the main challenges you encountered or are still facing now with the remediation in Japan? Your microphone is mute, Dr.
Sorry, thank you very much. MOE has never implemented such a big public project as decontamination project. Therefore, MOE asks other ministries to help MOE to promote decontamination work. With the cooperation with other ministries, MOE completed this project as scheduled. Through this project, MOE found that one of the most important things is how well MOE communicates with local communities and local residents. MOE thinks that the continuous and persistent communication efforts would be very important to implement such kind of public project. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a question for Bieke. So you presented this new framework for sustainability. To what extent can such an analysis of community capitals can be done, for instance, before a nuclear accident, or should it be done after something happens and there is a remediation needed?
Well, thank you for the question. I think the answer to it is both. Ideally, as I said, and it's the same for the stakeholder participation, the preparedness phase is here now. So it's the time to do this. If you have a clear assessment on what is present in a community, what you can build on, and this can be what kind of technological solutions are already there, what industries can help in this, what financial resources are there. If you know this beforehand and you can keep this up to date, this will make I think, making decisions in an emergency phase easier, and it will yield less adverse effects possibly on all of the dimensions, especially from a sustainability point of view. But even if it hasn't been done, it's still useful to do it afterwards. I wouldn't recommend doing it during an emergency. There are more urgent issues to address in an emergency phase. But afterwards, if this has not been done yet, it is the time to do it. And recovery phase does allow for this time to a certain extent, and it might make decisions more accepted, and it might receive wider support if you start from what is already there, and not coming in with your grand solution, but actually building on what is there with your community.
Okay, many thanks. We had one last question related to the Maestri project, which has a 2-year plan, 2020-2021, and a participant is asking what is the current status concerning our planning, considering the specific conditions in this year, in 2020. So the answer is that, of course, we are doing our best, just as anybody. We are working now on the baseline report, and we've had already collected some really good case studies from a number of member states. And further than that, I mean, this webinar is also one of the activities that we organize in the hope of joining together the community of practice. So I'd like to give now the word to Dr. Horst Monken-Fernandes from the International Atomic Energy Agency for a small summary and some concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Catrinel, and thank you very much all the presenters today. I think it's a very hard job to put together in short all the very nice comments that were made. I would like to begin with just a little clarification. The Maestri project will span from 2020-2021 for the baseline report, but we have already secure in our regular budget activities the continuation of the project for 2022-2023. And also on the question on financing of environmental remediation, we are working on that. We have already a report on a cost estimate of remediation projects, but we are working on a publication that will cover that aspect. And if there is any interest in to contribute to that activity, we can be reached through the email that you can make available, Catrinel. So I think that we have really a very good discussion, very good information was shared, and it became clear for everybody, I think, that environmental remediation is really and can be really a very complex endeavor. As Director Xerri mentioned, decisions should not be only based on technical issues, on science, but must include different dimensions. And the webinar, as he stressed in the beginning, is not only useful for the environmental remediation community, but also to many other fields. It's not about to tell people what and how they could do, but to make available a framework and calling the attention to the important aspects to be considered. Catrinel gave an overview of the Maestri project. She mentioned about the developing of a structured framework for decision-making, and that the project will involve working in 3 major task groups, one covering the framework for social multi-criteria evaluation, another one, a framework for social multi-criteria evaluation, and the third one on and how engaging communities by establishing a community of practice. Kuroda-san from Japan, he mentioned that engagement with stakeholders was absolutely fundamental for the successful implementation of decontamination works as they were planned. And it's estimated by the end of 2022, transport of all the waste accumulated in the interim storage facility shall be concluded. There is an attempt to reduce amount of soil to be disposed by application of recycling approaches. He also mentioned that correct information, not only with local community, but also with international communities, is important to be shared to eliminate misconception towards the Fukushima accident. And about the future, he mentioned the need of a reconstruction of occupation, support the decarbonization of the town, support the local revitalization and development, and green regeneration of Fukushima. David Collier mentioned about the British sites. He mentioned about the costs related with cleanup of Sellafield, a big part of, important part of the UK GDP in a year basis. Important that new regulatory thinking can open possibilities for money saving, and there is also the need to engage in a rational and fair discussion, but would be part of that conversation at the local, the regional, and the national level. He also mentioned that communities want to understand and provide input, not necessarily make decision. It's important, there was also a notice that you cannot engage the whole community, but structured methods can give confidence for that process. And this is where Maestri can play a role, contributing to the discussions by means of explaining the decision logic. Important also to mention that economic is not only cost, is more than cost, and communities will take costs in different ways depending on how the money will be expended. Bieke mentioned about environmental management as a decision-making system providing for moving from reductionism command and control management to integrated adaptive system-based approach. She mentioned about the difference between remediation in case of a legacy site and after an accident. She mentioned that in the case of environmental management of legacy sites, one is allowed to have a thorough reflection, rationales for participation and inclusion of social aspects in opposition where the remediation after an accident will focus in the first moment on health and safety issues, being these aspects of more importance, but then the shift might move into other phases of the remediation, especially during recovery phase. But important was the need for contextualization of the sense of community. Finally, Professor Munda talked about the reasonable solution and the importance to have a compromised solution in the framework that we are considering. Economics cannot answer what is most valuable. That will depend on the context, and there is absolute need to think about integration. We cannot reduce all the things we have the reason to value into homogeneous magnitude. And this is essentially the role to be played by multi-criteria analysis, meaning how to bring different elements together. So having said that, I think that the webinar was able to provide an understanding what we are trying to achieve. And I'd like to take the opportunity to invite all the participants in this webinar to take a look at the ENVIRONET webpage and to engage with us in this effort, which I believe will make a very important contribution to IAEA member states and to the international community. And this is all from me. And once again, thank you, Catrinel. Thank you, all the presenters, and thanks for all of those that were participating, following us in this very important and very useful webinar.
Thank you very much, Horst, for this good summary. So to close, I would like to thank the organizers, the SHARE platform, the International Atomic Energy Agency, also all the support they have been given. I'd like to thank the speakers and also, of course, to all attendants for your time. The webinar has been recorded and will be available on the website of the SHARE platform. And with this, I'd like to close this. Stay safe and see you at future activities.